Poland, 1942. The Nazi war machine had already swallowed half of Europe, and in the occupied territories, a single word from an SS officer could mean the difference between life and a cattle car to Treblinka. In the small town of Rozwadów, tucked away in the southeastern corner of the country, 8,000 Jews lived under the constant shadow of deportation. Every morning brought the same question: would today be the day the trucks arrived? But in this forgotten corner of the Holocaust, something impossible was about to happen. A local doctor, armed with nothing but test tubes, a microscope, and an understanding of Nazi paranoia, was about to pull off one of the most brilliant deceptions of World War II. He would create a disease that didn't exist, convince the SS that an entire region was infected with a deadly epidemic, and turn the Nazis' own fear against them. This is the story they don't teach in history class, because it reveals something the Third Reich never wanted you to know. That sometimes the greatest weapon against tyranny isn't a gun or a bomb, but a lie so perfect that evil itself becomes its own prison guard. Before the war, Rozwadów was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. The town sat along ancient trade routes, where Polish Catholics and Jews had lived side by side for generations, running shops, raising families, and sharing the same dusty streets. Dr. Eugene Lazowski was a young physician, barely 30 years old, who had studied medicine in Warsaw before returning to his hometown to open a small practice. He treated farmers with pneumonia, delivered babies in the middle of the night, and earned the trust of both communities. When the Germans invaded in September of 1939, that trust would become the most valuable currency in occupied Poland. The occupation was swift and brutal. Within weeks, the Nazis had divided the country, installed their administration, and begun implementing the racial laws that would lead to the final solution. Jews were forced to wear armbands, forbidden from most professions, and herded into overcrowded ghettos. In Rozwadów, the Jewish population swelled as refugees poured in from surrounding villages, all of them hoping that somehow this small town might be overlooked by the machinery of genocide. But the SS never overlooked anything. By 1942, the deportations had begun in earnest across occupied Poland. Town after town was declared judenfrei, cleansed of Jews, as entire communities were loaded onto trains and shipped east to the death camps. The pattern was always the same. SS units would arrive without warning, surround the ghetto, and give the inhabitants 2 hours to pack a single bag. Anyone who resisted was shot on the spot. Anyone too old or too sick to walk was shot on the spot. The trains left full and arrived at places with names that would become synonymous with industrialized murder: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. Dr. Lazowski watched this happen in neighboring towns and knew it was only a matter of time before the SS turned their attention to Rozwadów. He had already begun helping Jews in small ways, providing false medical certificates, hiding families in his home for short periods, but these were temporary measures. What was needed was something bigger, something that would make the Nazis afraid to even enter the region. The idea came to him during a routine examination of a patient named Stanisław Matulewicz, a fellow physician who would become his partner in this audacious scheme. They were discussing the Nazi obsession with racial hygiene and disease control when Matulewicz mentioned an obscure bacteriological phenomenon he had learned about during his medical training. The Germans, despite their industrial approach to mass murder, were deeply paranoid about infectious disease spreading among their own troops. They had strict protocols for quarantine zones, and any area suspected of harboring epidemic typhus was immediately isolated and avoided by all but specialized SS medical units. Typhus was the perfect terror weapon against the Nazis because it was associated with lice, filth, and the overcrowded conditions they themselves had created in the ghettos. The disease killed quickly and spread easily in close quarters, exactly the kind of environment found in military barracks and troop trains. If the SS believed that Rozwadów was infected with typhus, they would cordon off the entire area, and deportations would be impossible. But there was a problem. Typhus was a real disease with real symptoms, and the Germans had real doctors who knew how to diagnose it. You couldn't just claim there was an outbreak and expect the SS to take your word for it. They would demand proof, medical records, and most importantly, positive blood tests from infected patients. This is where Dr. Lazowski's medical training became a weapon. He knew that the standard test for typhus, called the Weil-Felix reaction, didn't actually detect the typhus bacteria itself. Instead, it detected antibodies that the human body produced in response to the infection. The test worked by mixing a patient's blood serum with a dead strain of Proteus bacteria and watching for a clumping reaction. In typhus patients, the antibodies would cause the Proteus cells to clump together in a distinctive pattern. But here was the genius part. Those same antibodies could be triggered by injecting a healthy person with a dead Proteus vaccine. The person would never get sick, would never be contagious, would never be in any danger, but their blood would test positive for typhus. The plan was staggering in its simplicity and its audacity. Dr. Lazowski and Dr. Matulewicz would inject healthy Polish Catholics in the surrounding villages with the harmless Proteus vaccine, wait for their bodies to produce the antibodies, and then submit their blood samples to the German medical authorities as proof of a typhus outbreak. The Nazis would see dozens, then hundreds of positive tests coming from the region around WWII, and their own protocols would force them to declare a quarantine zone. The Jewish population, trapped inside what the Germans would perceive as a disease-ridden area, would be left alone because no SS officer wanted to risk infection for the sake of deporting Jews who were, in the Nazi mindset, going to die anyway. It was a medical magic trick, using the enemy's own fear and bureaucracy as a shield. But if the deception was discovered, both doctors would be executed immediately, along with their families and probably half the town. The stakes could not have been higher, and the margin for error was zero. The first injection happened in the winter of 1942 in a farmhouse outside WWII, where the windows were covered with thick curtains and the doors were locked. Dr. Lazowski had chosen his first test subject carefully, a Polish farmer named Jan, who had already lost 2 cousins to Nazi firing squads and who understood exactly what was at stake. The doctor explained the plan in whispered tones, showing Jan the vial of dead Proteus bacteria and assuring him that it was completely harmless, that his body would produce antibodies without ever becoming sick, and that in 2 weeks his blood would test positive for typhus. Jan rolled up his sleeve without hesitation. He knew that if this worked, it might save the Jewish families he had grown up alongside, the shopkeepers and tailors and teachers who were now trapped in the overcrowded ghetto, waiting for the trucks to arrive. The needle went in, the vaccine was administered, and the most dangerous game of chess against the Third Reich had officially begun. 2 weeks later, Dr. Lazowski drew Jan's blood and sent it to the German medical laboratory in Zamość with a formal report claiming suspected typhus in the region. The wait was excruciating. If the German doctors suspected anything, if they decided to visit the farm and examine Jan in person, the entire scheme would collapse before it even started. But the Nazi bureaucracy, for all its efficiency and murder, was remarkably trusting of its own medical protocols. The lab results came back within days, positive for epidemic typhus. No questions asked, no follow-up examination required. The Germans had tested the blood using their standard Weil-Felix procedure, seen the telltale clumping reaction, and filed their report. One positive case wasn't enough to trigger a quarantine, but it was enough to put the region on their medical surveillance list. Dr. Lazowski and Dr. Matulewicz exchanged a glance that needed no words. The test had worked. The disease that didn't exist had just claimed its first victim on paper, and the SS had believed every word of it. Now came the hard part, scaling up the deception without getting caught. The 2 doctors began a carefully choreographed campaign, traveling to villages throughout the region under the pretense of routine medical checkups. They would arrive at a farmhouse, close the shutters, and explain the plan to families who had everything to lose. Some people were terrified, convinced that any injection from a doctor in occupied Poland might be poison or a Nazi trick. Others understood immediately and volunteered their entire families. The doctors kept meticulous fake records, creating symptoms that didn't exist, documenting fevers that had never occurred, and building a paper trail of an epidemic that was spreading through the Polish Catholic population at an alarming rate. Every 2 weeks, new blood samples were sent to the German lab in Zamość, and every 2 weeks, more positive results came back. Within 3 months, The Germans had documented over 100 cases of typhus in the WWII region, a number that would have triggered alarm bells in any public health system. The SS response was exactly what the doctors had hoped for and exactly what they had feared. In the spring of 1943, German medical officers arrived in Roswadov to investigate the outbreak, and for the first time, the deception would be tested face to face with the enemy. Dr. Lazowski met them at the edge of town, wearing his white coat and carrying a briefcase full of falsified medical records. He played his role perfectly, the concerned local physician overwhelmed by a disease he couldn't control, eager for German expertise and assistance. He guided the SS doctors to the homes of patients who had been coached on exactly what symptoms to describe, families who lay in their beds and complained of headaches, fever and body aches, while their blood, full of harmless antibodies, told the story the Germans expected to hear. The Nazi doctors never examined the patients too closely. Typhus was associated with lice and filth, with the kind of poverty and overcrowding they believed was inherent to the Slavic race, and they had no desire to spend more time than necessary in what they perceived as a contaminated zone. The quarantine order came down within a week. The entire region around Roswadov, encompassing dozens of villages and including the Jewish ghetto, was declared a restricted epidemic zone under German military health regulations. No SS units were to enter the area except under emergency orders, no trains would stop at the local stations, and no deportations would be scheduled until the outbreak was brought under control. On paper, it was a routine public health measure, the kind of quarantine protocol that had been used for centuries to contain infectious disease. In reality, it was an invisible fortress built from lies and blood tests, a wall that the SS couldn't see but wouldn't cross, and behind that wall 8,000 Jews continued to live when they should have been dead. Dr. Lazowski had done the impossible. He had weaponized Nazi paranoia, turned their own medical system against them, and bought time measured not in days or weeks, but in years. Maintaining the deception required a level of precision that would have impressed a master spy. Every month, Dr. Lazowski and Dr. Matulewicz had to produce new cases to keep the epidemic alive in German records without making it so severe that the SS would decide to quarantine the entire population in a camp or simply burn the villages to the ground. It was a tightrope walk over an abyss. Too few cases, and the Germans would declare the outbreak contained and lift the quarantine. Too many cases, and they might decide the situation was out of control and take drastic measures. The doctors settled on a steady rhythm, 15 to 20 new positive tests every month, scattered across different villages, with careful attention to making the pattern look natural. Some months the numbers would spike slightly, as if the disease was spreading. Other months they would drop, as if containment measures were working. It had to look real, unpredictable, and just dangerous enough to keep the SS at bay. The logistics of the operation were staggering. The Proteus vaccine had to be manufactured in secret, stored without refrigeration, in a country where medical supplies were strictly controlled by the occupying forces, and administered to dozens of people every week, without arousing suspicion. Dr. Lazowski converted part of his home into a makeshift laboratory, growing the Proteus bacteria in conditions that would have horrified any modern health inspector, but were sufficient for his purposes. He would heat-kill the bacteria, prepare the injections by candlelight after curfew, and hide the vials in hollowed-out medical textbooks that sat innocuously on his shelves. Distribution was handled through a network of trusted messengers, often children who could move through the countryside without attracting German attention, carrying what looked like ordinary medicine, but was actually the raw material for the most successful medical fraud in history. Every person involved knew that discovery meant death, not just for themselves but for their families. Yet month after month, year after year, not a single person broke under the pressure or betrayed the secret. The German response to the ongoing epidemic revealed the strange contradictions at the heart of Nazi ideology. On one hand, they were conducting a genocide that would ultimately murder 6 million Jews with industrial efficiency. On the other hand, they were terrified of a disease that might kill a few dozen German soldiers. The SS kept Roswadov under quarantine, not out of any concern for Polish or Jewish lives, but because typhus represented a threat to the Wehrmacht, to the purity of German blood, and to the smooth functioning of their war machine. Dr. Lazowski understood this psychology perfectly and exploited it ruthlessly. He made sure that every report emphasized the danger to German personnel, that every communication with the Nazi medical authorities stressed how conscientiously he was trying to contain the outbreak to protect the occupying forces. He played the role of the dutiful colonial subject, grateful for German oversight, desperate for their approval, while secretly building a wall of fake test results that kept the death trains away from his town. But the quarantine, as effective as it was, couldn't shield the Jewish population from all the horrors of occupation. Life in the Rozwadów ghetto was still a daily struggle for survival. Food was scarce, medicine was almost non-existent, and the psychological weight of living under Nazi rule was crushing. People died from malnutrition, from untreated illnesses, from the sheer stress of wondering if today would be the day the deception was discovered. Dr. Lazowski did what he could, smuggling food and medicine into the ghetto, treating patients who couldn't risk going to a hospital, and providing what comfort he could to people living in limbo. The Jews of Rozwadów knew something unusual was protecting them, that their town had been spared when so many others had been destroyed, but most didn't know the full truth. It was safer that way. The fewer people who knew about the fake epidemic, the smaller the chance of the secret spreading to someone who might talk under torture, or trade the information for better rations. As 1943 turned into 1944, the strategic situation across Europe began to shift. The Red Army was pushing west after their victory at Stalingrad, the Allies had landed in Italy, and the once invincible Wehrmacht was being ground down on multiple fronts. In occupied Poland, the Nazi grip was tightening in some ways and loosening in others. Resources were being diverted to the Eastern Front. German administrators were becoming more paranoid and unpredictable, and the deportation machinery that had run so efficiently in 1942 was now operating more sporadically as trains were needed for military transport. The typhus quarantine around Rozwadów remained in place, reinforced every month by Dr. Lazowski's steady stream of positive blood tests, but now it was protecting the Jewish population, not just from deportation, but from the chaotic violence of a collapsing occupation. The lie had taken on a life of its own, appearing in German medical journals, referenced in Wehrmacht health briefings, a permanent fixture on the epidemic maps that hung in SS headquarters across Poland. The closest call came in the autumn of 1944, when a new German medical officer arrived in the region with a reputation for thoroughness that terrified Dr. Lazowski. His name was Hauptsturmführer Schmidt, and unlike the previous Nazi doctors, who had been content to review paperwork from a safe distance, Schmidt was a true believer in racial science, who saw disease control as an extension of the war against inferior peoples. He announced his intention to personally inspect every village in the quarantine zone, to examine patients himself, and to collect fresh blood samples that would be tested not just in Zamość, but in laboratories in Kraków and Warsaw. If Schmidt followed through on even half of these promises, the deception would be exposed within days. Dr. Lazowski would be arrested, tortured for information about his network of accomplices, and executed. The 8,000 Jews in Rozwadów would be loaded onto trains immediately, and the fake epidemic that had protected them for 2 years would become just another footnote in the history of failed resistance. Dr. Lazowski knew he had one advantage: German arrogance. Schmidt, like every Nazi officer, believed himself to be dealing with inferior Slavic minds, with peasant doctors who had been trained in backward Polish universities and who couldn't possibly match the sophistication of German medical science. So Lazowski decided to use that arrogance as a weapon. When Schmidt arrived for his inspection tour, Lazowski greeted him with a carefully calibrated mixture of deference and professional pride. He gave Schmidt the grand tour, showing him the makeshift isolation wards, the detailed patient records, the charts tracking the spread of infection. But every location Lazowski chose for the inspection was strategic. He took Schmidt to villages on the outer edge of the quarantine zone, to homes where the poorest Polish Catholics lived in conditions that reinforced every Nazi stereotype about Slavic filth and backwardness. These were the patients who had been injected with the Proteus vaccine weeks earlier, whose blood would test positive, but who had been coached to appear sick in ways that would make any German doctor reluctant to get too close. The performance was worthy of a theatre award. Patients lay in darkened rooms, complaining of the classic typhus symptoms: high fever, severe headache, sensitivity to light. Their families had strategically neglected to clean the homes before Schmidt's arrival, leaving them dusty and cluttered to reinforce the association between typhus and poor hygiene. Most importantly, Lazowski made sure that each home had visible evidence of lice, the insects that actually transmitted real typhus. He had collected lice from farm animals and scattered them in the bedding, knowing that the sight of the parasites would trigger every instinct in a German doctor to maintain distance and avoid contamination. Schmidt examined patients from across the room, holding a handkerchief over his nose, barking questions that Dr. Lazowski translated and answered. The Nazi doctor drew blood samples personally, labeling each vial with Germanic precision, and promised that the results would determine whether the quarantine would continue or whether more drastic measures would be necessary. The waiting period was agony. 2 weeks passed with no word from Schmidt or the German medical authorities. Dr. Lazowski went about his normal routine, treating patients and preparing more fake cases, but every night he lay awake wondering if tomorrow would bring the Gestapo to his door. Dr. Matulewicz became so anxious that he developed a stress-related rash, which he grimly joked was the only real disease in their fake epidemic. The Jewish families in Rozwadów sensed that something had changed, that the protection they had enjoyed might be evaporating, and some began making desperate plans for escape into the forests or across the border into Slovakia. The entire town held its breath, waiting for a verdict that would mean either continued life or immediate death. The results came back exactly as Dr. Lazowski had predicted. Every blood sample Schmidt had collected tested positive for typhus antibodies. The German laboratories in Krakow confirmed the findings. Schmidt submitted a report recommending that the quarantine around Rozwadów not only be maintained, but be expanded to include additional villages that might be at risk of infection. The Hauptsturmführer concluded his report with a paragraph praising the local Polish medical personnel for their diligent efforts to contain the outbreak under difficult conditions and recommending that additional medical supplies be allocated to the region. He never visited Rozwadów again. The inspection that should have ended the deception had instead strengthened it, adding the seal of approval from a German racial scientist to the mountain of evidence supporting the existence of an epidemic that had never infected a single person. By the winter of 1944, the fake epidemic had become such an accepted fact in German military medicine that it appeared in official Wehrmacht disease maps distributed to units across the Eastern Front. Staff officers planning troop movements would glance at those maps and route their soldiers around the Rozwadów region to avoid exposure. Supply convoys took longer routes to bypass the quarantine zone. Even the Gestapo, normally indifferent to health concerns when Jewish deportations were at stake, filed reports noting that the Rozwadów ghetto remained under medical isolation and that any action against its inhabitants would need to wait until the typhus situation was resolved. The absurdity was almost beautiful. The most efficient killing machine in human history, an organization that had murdered millions with assembly line precision, was being held at bay by a disease that existed only on paper and in test tubes. Dr. Lazowski had essentially created a force field made of antibodies and bureaucratic inertia, and it was working far better than anyone had dared to hope. But success brought its own dangers. The longer the epidemic continued, the more questions began to emerge from German medical authorities in Berlin. Why wasn't the death rate higher if the infection was so widespread? In most typhus outbreaks, between 10 and 40% of infected patients died, yet the mortality reports from Rozwadów showed only a handful of deaths over 2 years. Why hadn't the disease spread beyond the quarantine zone into neighboring regions despite the movement of farmers and traders across the boundaries? Why were there no cases among the German soldiers stationed just outside the affected area? These were exactly the kinds of questions that could unravel everything, and Dr. Lazowski knew he needed answers that would satisfy German scrutiny without inviting closer inspection. He began falsifying death certificates, claiming that typhus patients had died from other causes like heart failure or pneumonia to make the numbers look more realistic. He wrote reports explaining that the quarantine had been so effective precisely because of German organizational superiority and Polish cooperation. Every explanation he offered played into Nazi assumptions about their own competence and racial theories about disease susceptibility. The Jewish population, trapped inside this elaborate medical fiction, existed in a strange state of suspended animation. They were still subject to forced labor, still required to wear the Star of David armbands, still living under the constant threat of Nazi violence, but they were alive when they should have been dead. Families celebrated holidays in secret, children continued to study in underground schools, and people held on to the hope that if they could just survive long enough, the war might end before the quarantine was lifted. Some of them had figured out that something unusual was protecting them, that the typhus outbreak didn't match their lived experience of relatively good health. Rumors circulated through the ghetto about Dr. Lazowski and his mysterious activities, about the Polish families in surrounding villages who seemed to recover from typhus with suspicious speed, but these rumors were spoken in whispers and never written down. Everyone understood that the survival of 8,000 people depended on a secret that couldn't be shared, a collective act of willful ignorance that was as important as the medical deception itself. Dr. Lazowski himself was deteriorating under the strain. 2 years of living with the knowledge that a single mistake could lead to mass murder had taken a physical toll. He had lost weight. His hands developed a tremor that made drawing blood samples difficult, and he suffered from insomnia so severe that he began to hallucinate from exhaustion. Dr. Matulewicz urged him to take a break, to let someone else handle the monthly blood samples for even a few weeks, but Lazowski refused. He had become obsessed with maintaining perfect control over every detail of the operation, convinced that any deviation from the established pattern would trigger German suspicion. He personally examined every vial of Proteus vaccine, personally selected which villages would report new cases each month, and personally delivered blood samples to the German laboratory in Zamość. His wife begged him to consider their own children, to recognize that if he collapsed from exhaustion, the entire scheme would collapse with him, but Lazowski saw only the 8,000 faces he was trying to save. The turning point came in January of 1945, when the distant thunder of Soviet artillery could be heard from the east. The Red Army was advancing faster than anyone had expected, pushing the Wehrmacht back toward the German border, and suddenly the typhus quarantine around Rozwadów became irrelevant. German units were retreating in disorder, abandoning positions, burning documents, and executing prisoners to eliminate witnesses. The local SS commander received orders to liquidate the Rozwadów ghetto before withdrawing, to leave no Jews alive who might testify about German occupation policies. It was the nightmare scenario. After 2 years of successfully protecting the Jewish population through medical deception, they were about to be murdered anyway in the chaotic final days of Nazi rule. Dr. Lazowski had saved 8,000 people from the gas chambers, only to lose them to firing squads in the final hours before liberation. The liquidation order came on a frozen morning in late January, delivered to the local SS commander by a motorcycle courier from regional headquarters. The Jews of Rozwadów were to be assembled in the town square within 24 hours, sorted by ability to march, and those who could walk would be force-marched west toward camps inside Germany, while those who couldn't would be shot on sight. It was the same brutal calculus that had been applied to hundreds of other ghettos as the Nazi Empire collapsed. Eliminate the evidence, leave no witnesses, and retreat. The SS commander, a career officer named Hauptsturmführer Keller, who had overseen the quarantine arrangements for 2 years, began organizing his men for the operation. He requisitioned trucks, assembled ammunition, and prepared lists of Jewish community leaders to be executed first. But then something unexpected happened. Keller reviewed his medical files and discovered that the Rozwadów ghetto was still officially under typhus quarantine, and according to Wehrmacht health regulations, no mass assembly of infected populations was permitted without authorization from military medical command. The same bureaucratic system that had protected the Jews for 2 years was about to protect them one final time. Keller faced a choice. He could ignore the health regulations, carry out the liquidation, and risk censure from his superiors for violating protocols that were designed to protect German troops from disease. Or he could follow procedure, request authorization from medical command, and wait for approval that might never come as the Red Army closed in. For a Nazi officer in January of 1945, with the war clearly lost and career advancement no longer relevant, the path of least resistance was to follow the rules and pass responsibility up the chain of command. Keller sent a telegram to regional headquarters asking for clarification on how to proceed with a quarantined population, noting that the typhus epidemic was still active according to the most recent medical reports. The telegram went unanswered. He sent a second telegram marked urgent and received a terse reply telling him to use his own judgment but to prioritize the retreat of combat units. The infrastructure of Nazi administration was collapsing, and in that collapse there was suddenly room for inaction. Keller decided to postpone the liquidation until he received clear orders, and those clear orders never came. Dr. Lazowski watched these developments with a mixture of hope and terror. He knew the Soviet advance was close, could hear the artillery getting louder every day, but he also knew that desperate men committed desperate acts and that the SS might decide to murder the Jews simply out of spite before fleeing west. He continued his routine, submitting blood samples, maintaining the fiction of the epidemic, giving the Germans one more reason to delay. On the night of January 27th, he walked through the ghetto under cover of darkness, visiting families he had known for years, delivering what medicine he had left, and preparing them for whatever was coming. Some people thanked him for his efforts, somehow understanding that he had played a role in their survival, even if they didn't know the details. Others were too exhausted and traumatized to care, simply waiting for the end. Children who had spent their entire childhood under occupation asked him if the war was really almost over, and he told them yes, that the Soviets were coming, that they just needed to survive a few more days. Those few more days felt like years. German troops began retreating through Roswadov in increasing numbers, exhausted soldiers who had been fighting since Stalingrad and who wanted nothing more than to reach the German border before the Red Army caught them. Some of them looted the town, stealing food and valuables, but they left the ghetto alone. The typhus warning signs that had been posted at the ghetto entrance for 2 years were still there, faded and weather-beaten, but still legible, and even in retreat, German soldiers gave them a wide berth. Hauptsturmführer Keller and most of his SS unit evacuated on January 29th, taking their files and burning what they couldn't carry. The local collaborators who had worked with the Germans fled into the countryside, knowing what Soviet justice would look like. And suddenly, Roswadov was in a strange limbo, officially still under Nazi occupation, but practically abandoned, with 8,000 Jews waiting behind the invisible wall of a disease that had never existed. The Red Army entered Roswadov on February 1st, 1945. Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of brutal warfare and used to discovering the evidence of Nazi atrocities, were stunned to find a Jewish community still intact. They had liberated dozens of ghettos and camps across Poland, always arriving too late, always finding only mass graves and a handful of survivors. But here, in this unremarkable town that wasn't even marked on most military maps, 8,000 Jews emerged from their homes, weak and traumatized, but alive. The Soviet political officers immediately began investigating, trying to understand how this population had survived when so many others had been annihilated. They questioned Dr. Lazowski, expecting to hear about partisan resistance or secret bunkers, and instead he told them the truth. He had invented a disease, forged thousands of blood tests, and convinced the Nazis to quarantine the town for 2 years. The Soviet officers stared at him in disbelief, then slowly began to laugh. It was the kind of story that seemed impossible, the kind of victory that shouldn't have worked, and yet here was the evidence standing in front of them. 8,000 living witnesses to the fact that sometimes, in the darkest moments of history, intelligence and courage could triumph over industrialized evil. The aftermath of liberation revealed the true scale of what Dr. Lazowski had accomplished. As Soviet forces pushed further into Poland and began documenting the Holocaust, a grim statistical picture emerged. Of the 3.3 million Jews who had lived in Poland before the war, only 300,000 survived. Entire communities had been erased from existence. Cities like Warsaw, Łódź, and Krakow, that had been centers of Jewish life for centuries, were now graveyards. The death camps had processed human beings with industrial efficiency. Treblinka alone had murdered 900,000 people in just over a year. Against this backdrop of near-total annihilation, the survival of 8,000 Jews in a single small town was nothing short of miraculous. Soviet military intelligence officers began a formal investigation, not because they suspected wrongdoing, but because they needed to understand how this pocket of resistance had succeeded when so many others had failed. They interviewed hundreds of residents, cross-referenced German documents captured during the retreat, and gradually pieced together the full story of the phantom epidemic. What made Dr. Lazowski's deception so effective was how perfectly it exploited the contradictions at the heart of Nazi ideology. The same regime that had built a sophisticated medical infrastructure to implement racial science and eugenics programs was paralyzed by fear of infectious disease. The same SS officers who could efficiently organize the mass murder of thousands were terrified of a bacteria they couldn't see. The Nazis had created a vast bureaucracy to administer death, complete with forms, regulations, and protocols, and Dr. Lazowski had simply inserted his fake epidemic into that bureaucracy and let it function exactly as designed. Every positive blood test was filed in triplicate. Every quarantine report was reviewed by multiple levels of command. Every medical recommendation was implemented according to Wehrmacht health regulations. The deception worked not in spite of Nazi efficiency, but because of it. The system was so rigidly hierarchical and rule-bound that once the fake epidemic was embedded in official records, no individual officer had the authority or the willingness to question it. The human cost of maintaining the deception for 2 years was something Dr. Lazowski rarely discussed in the immediate aftermath of liberation. He had administered over 3,000 injections of Proteus vaccine to Polish Catholics in surrounding villages, turning them into unwitting participants in the scheme. None of them had suffered serious health consequences, but all of them had lived under the threat of Nazi discovery and execution. Dr. Matulewicz, his partner in the operation, had suffered a mental breakdown in the final weeks before liberation and would spend months recovering in a Soviet military hospital. Dr. Lazowski himself was physically and emotionally shattered, having lost nearly 20 kilograms during the war and developed chronic health problems that would plague him for the rest of his life. His wife had endured 2 years of watching her husband risk execution every single day, never knowing if the Gestapo would kick down their door in the middle of the night. The moral weight of knowing that 8,000 lives depended on his continued success had nearly crushed him. Yet in the spring of 1945, as Europe began the slow process of rebuilding from the rubble, Dr. Lazowski found himself in a strange position. He was a hero who couldn't celebrate, a man who had saved thousands of lives but was surrounded by millions of deaths. The Jewish families he had protected were free but traumatized, trying to rebuild lives in a country that had been complicit in their persecution. Many of them would eventually emigrate to Israel or America, seeking a future in places that hadn't tried to exterminate them. Dr. Lazowski returned to practicing medicine, treating the diseases that were all too real in post-war Poland. Tuberculosis, malnutrition, typhus, that was actual typhus. He rarely spoke about what he had done, partly from modesty, but also from the survivor's instinct that telling the story might somehow tempt fate, might reveal that the miracle had been nothing more than luck and timing. The full story of the phantom epidemic didn't become widely known until decades later, after Dr. Lazowski emigrated to the United States in the 1950s and began speaking publicly about his wartime experiences. Even then, many people found the tale difficult to believe. How could a simple country doctor outsmart the Nazi medical establishment? How could a fake disease based on a quirk of antibody testing protect 8,000 people for 2 years? The story seemed too neat, too much like a Hollywood screenplay, and yet it was all documented in captured German files, corroborated by hundreds of witnesses and verified by medical experts who examined Dr. Lazowski's methods. It was real, it had worked, and it stood as a testament to a simple truth. That in the face of industrialized evil, sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't violence, but intelligence, not force, but deception, not heroism in the traditional sense, but the quiet courage to lie in service of a greater truth. The technical brilliance of Dr. Lazowski's scheme becomes even more impressive when you understand the science he exploited. The Weil-Felix test, developed in 1916 by Austrian scientists Edmund Weil and Arthur Felix, was the standard diagnostic tool for typhus throughout World War II. It worked on a principle of cross-reactivity. When the human body is infected with Rickettsia prowazekii, the bacteria that causes epidemic typhus, it produces antibodies that happen to also react with certain strains of Proteus bacteria. The test was cheap, relatively easy to perform, and gave results within hours, making it perfect for field use by military medical units. But it had a fatal flaw that Dr. Lazowski recognized immediately. The test didn't actually detect the typhus bacteria itself. It detected antibodies, and those antibodies could be triggered by injecting someone with dead Proteus bacteria that posed absolutely no health risk. A person injected with Proteus OX19, the specific strain used in the Weil-Felix test, would produce antibodies identical to those produced by actual typhus infection, would test positive on every diagnostic protocol the Germans used, but would never be sick, never be contagious, and never be in any danger whatsoever. The genius of the deception lay in understanding what the Germans would and wouldn't verify. Nazi medical officers were trained to trust laboratory results, to believe in the authority of scientific testing, and to assume that backward Polish doctors couldn't possibly manipulate sophisticated diagnostic procedures. When blood samples from Rozwadów consistently tested positive using the standard Weil-Felix protocol, the Germans never questioned whether the test itself might be unreliable or whether someone might be deliberately triggering false positives. They saw the clumping reaction in the test tubes, compared it to their medical textbooks, and filed their reports. The few times German doctors visited the region to inspect patients, Dr. Lazowski made sure they saw exactly what they expected: poor sanitary conditions, visible lice infestations, and patients complaining of fever and headache. The Germans never performed autopsies on the supposed typhus victims because Nazi racial ideology taught them that Slavic corpses were sources of contamination to be avoided. They never took tissue samples for microscopic analysis because that would have required extended time in the quarantine zone. Every scientific procedure that might have exposed the fraud was something the Nazis were psychologically predisposed to avoid. Dr. Lazowski also understood the power of consistency. For 2 years, the epidemic statistics from Rozwadów followed a predictable pattern: steady new cases, low but believable mortality rates, seasonal variations that matched what medical literature said about typhus transmission. He never allowed the numbers to spike dramatically, which might have triggered a draconian response like burning down infected villages. He never let them drop to zero, which would have ended the quarantine. He maintained the Goldilocks zone of just enough disease to justify continued isolation, but not so much disease that it demanded radical intervention. This required an encyclopedic knowledge of epidemiology, of how real outbreaks behaved, and of how German medical bureaucrats thought. Every monthly report was a work of scientific fiction, carefully crafted to be boring enough to avoid scrutiny, while being alarming enough to maintain the quarantine status. The psychological dimensions of the operation were equally sophisticated. Dr. Lazowski had to manage not just the Germans, but also the Polish Catholic population that was knowingly participating in the fraud, and the Jewish population that mostly didn't know but might accidentally reveal the truth through their obvious good health. He created a culture of secrecy where everyone understood that asking too many questions was dangerous, where rumors were discouraged, and where the less people knew about the mechanics of their own salvation, the safer everyone would be. He also had to manage his own fear, his own moral doubts about putting Polish families at risk of Nazi retaliation, and his own exhaustion from maintaining a lie that required perfect execution every single day for 730 days. There were moments when he considered confessing, when the weight of responsibility seemed unbearable, when he wondered if he was just delaying the inevitable and putting more people in danger. But every time he wavered, He would visit the ghetto and see the children playing in the streets, and he would find the strength to prepare another batch of fake blood samples. The mathematical precision of the operation is staggering when you calculate the numbers. Over 2 years, Dr. Lazowski and Dr. Weil-Felix administered approximately 3,000 Proteus injections to generate roughly 1,200 positive blood tests that were submitted to German laboratories. Those 1,200 false positives convinced Nazi medical authorities that an epidemic of epidemic typhus was ravaging a region containing approximately 50,000 total inhabitants, of whom 8,000 were Jews marked for deportation. The cost was 0 German lives, 0 actual infections, and a few thousand doses of harmless bacterial vaccine. The benefit was 8,000 human beings who lived when they should have died, who saw liberation when they should have seen Treblinka, who had children and grandchildren who exist today because a country doctor understood that sometimes the best medicine isn't a cure, but a lie told at exactly the right moment to exactly the right people. After the war ended, Dr. Eugene Lazowski faced a new challenge: surviving under Soviet occupation. Poland had been liberated from Nazi tyranny only to fall under Stalin's control, and the communist regime viewed anyone with Western medical training or connections to the previous social order with deep suspicion. Dr. Lazowski's wartime heroism meant nothing to Soviet authorities, who were more interested in political loyalty than in past accomplishments. He continued practicing medicine in Roswadov for several years, treating the physical and psychological wounds of a population that had survived the unsurvivable, but he could feel the walls closing in. The secret police began investigating intellectuals and professionals who might pose a threat to communist rule. Former members of the Polish resistance were being arrested and executed. Jewish survivors who had hoped to reclaim their property or rebuild their lives found themselves facing a new wave of anti-Semitism, this time from their Polish neighbors who had occupied Jewish homes and businesses during the war and had no intention of giving them back. By 1948, the situation had become untenable, and Dr. Lazowski made the difficult decision to flee. The escape was nearly as dangerous as anything he had done during the war. Communist Poland had sealed its borders, and leaving the country without permission was considered treason, punishable by death. Lazowski used the same skills that had saved 8,000 Jews to save his own family, forging documents, bribing officials, and navigating a black market network of smugglers who specialized in getting people across the border into Czechoslovakia. From there, he made his way west through a Europe that was still recovering from 6 years of total war, through displaced persons camps filled with Holocaust survivors and former prisoners of war, through zones of occupation controlled by different Allied powers, until finally reaching the United States in 1958. He arrived in America with almost nothing, a medical degree that wasn't recognized by U.S. authorities, limited English language skills, and memories that would give him nightmares for the rest of his life. He had to retrain, pass new medical licensing exams, and essentially start his career over at an age when most doctors were established in their practice. Dr. Lazowski eventually settled in Chicago, where a small Polish community helped him rebuild his life. He worked at a community hospital, treating immigrant families and slowly rebuilding his reputation. For years, he said almost nothing about his wartime activities. In the America of the 1950s and 60s, Holocaust stories were not widely discussed. Survivors often faced skepticism or indifference, and the full horror of what had happened in Europe was only beginning to enter public consciousness. Dr. Lazowski focused on his patients, on providing for his family, and on trying to process the trauma of everything he had witnessed. But in the 1970s, as historical interest in Holocaust resistance stories began to grow, researchers tracking down survivors and documenting their experiences discovered Dr. Lazowski's story through interviews with Jews from Roswadov who had emigrated to Israel and America. They contacted him, asked him to verify the details, and slowly convinced him that his story needed to be told. The recognition came late, but it came powerfully. In 1983, Yad Vashem, Israel's official Holocaust memorial, recognized Dr. Lazowski and Dr. Stanisław Matulewicz as righteous among the nations, an honor given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Dr. Lazowski traveled to Jerusalem to receive the medal and to plant a tree on the Avenue of the Righteous, standing alongside other rescuers whose courage had preserved fragments of a civilization that the Nazis had tried to erase. He met survivors from Rozwadów, now elderly men and women with children and grandchildren, who embraced him with tears and told him that every moment of their lives since 1945 was a gift he had given them. Medical journals began publishing articles about his innovative use of the Weil-Felix test, analyzing his technique and marveling at the audacity of the deception. He was invited to speak at universities, at Holocaust memorial events, and at medical conferences where his story was used to teach ethics and creative problem-solving. Yet Dr. Lazowski remained remarkably modest about his accomplishments. In interviews, he insisted that he had simply done what any doctor should do: protect his patients. He deflected praise by emphasizing the bravery of Dr. Matulewicz, of the Polish Catholic families who had accepted the Proteus injections, knowing they might be executed if discovered, and of the Jewish families who had endured 2 years in the ghetto without knowing the full truth of what protected them. He acknowledged luck and timing, noting that if the Germans had been slightly more thorough, if even one Nazi doctor had decided to perform a tissue biopsy on a supposed typhus victim, the entire scheme would have collapsed. He spoke about the 8,000 who survived, but also about the 3 million Polish Jews who didn't, about the moral complexity of celebrating a successful rescue when it represented such a tiny percentage of the total catastrophe. His humility only made the story more powerful, revealing a man who understood that heroism wasn't about glory, but about doing what was necessary when the alternative was unconscionable. Dr. Eugene Lazowski died in 2006 at the age of 93, having lived long enough to see his story transform from a footnote in Holocaust history into a widely recognized example of medical resistance against tyranny. By the time of his death, his deception had been featured in books, documentaries, and medical school curricula around the world. The phantom epidemic of Rozwadów had become a case study in creative problem-solving, in the ethics of deception during wartime, and in the power of scientific knowledge wielded against political evil. Yet despite this recognition, the story remains relatively unknown compared to other Holocaust narratives. There are no major motion pictures about Dr. Lazowski, no best-selling novels dramatizing his exploits, no monuments in Washington or Berlin commemorating the 8,000 Jews saved by a fake disease. The story doesn't fit neatly into our preferred narratives about World War II, where heroism usually involves weapons and warfare rather than test tubes and paperwork. The reason this story matters today goes far beyond its historical significance. We live in an era where scientific literacy is under attack, where expertise is dismissed as elitism, and where conspiracy theories spread faster than facts. Dr. Lazowski's story is a reminder that science, properly understood and creatively applied, can be a weapon against authoritarianism. He didn't defeat the Nazis with superior firepower or military strategy. He defeated them by understanding their own systems better than they did, by exploiting the gap between what they thought they knew and what was actually true. The Weil-Felix test was Nazi Germany's own approved diagnostic protocol, developed by respected scientists and used throughout the Wehrmacht Medical Corps. Dr. Lazowski simply recognized its vulnerability and weaponized that knowledge. In an age of misinformation and scientific denialism, this story shows what happens when we trust evidence-based medicine. It saves lives, even when the evidence has been carefully manufactured to serve a higher moral purpose. The ethical questions raised by Dr. Lazowski's deception remain relevant and deeply uncomfortable. He lied to save lives, but those lies put Polish Catholic families at risk without their full informed consent. He forged medical documents, violated professional ethics about honesty in medical reporting, and corrupted the scientific process by deliberately producing false data. If a doctor did any of these things today, they would lose their medical license and face criminal prosecution. Yet few people would argue that Dr. Lazowski did anything wrong. His story forces us to confront the limits of absolute moral rules and to acknowledge that sometimes the right thing to do is technically illegal, unethical by peacetime standards, and impossible to justify except in the context of existential evil. The phantom epidemic exists in a moral gray zone that we're uncomfortable discussing. The space where deception becomes virtuous and where breaking the rules becomes the highest form of professional integrity. The descendants of the 8,000 Jews saved by Dr. Lazowski now number in the tens of thousands, scattered across Israel, the United States, Europe, and South America. They are doctors and teachers, artists and engineers, grandparents telling their grandchildren about a town in Poland where something impossible happened. They exist because one man understood that the Nazis, for all their industrial efficiency and bureaucratic thoroughness, had a fatal weakness. They trusted their own systems too much and feared disease more than they hated Jews. Every child born to those families, every accomplishment achieved, every moment of joy experienced, is a direct rebuke to the Nazi vision of a world without Jews. The phantom epidemic didn't just save 8,000 lives in 1943. It created entire family trees that branch forward through time, a forest of human possibility that grows larger with every passing generation. This is why the story of Dr. Eugene Lazowski deserves to be remembered, taught and celebrated, not because it's a feel-good tale of triumph over evil, though it certainly is that, not because it demonstrates the power of intelligence and creativity, though it does that too, but because it proves something that authoritarian regimes throughout history have tried to suppress, that systems can be hacked, that bureaucracies can be fooled, that even the most efficient machinery of death has vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited by someone brave enough and smart enough to find them. The 8,000 Jews of Roswadov survived because Dr. Lazowski refused to accept that their fate was inevitable, refused to believe that individual action was meaningless against industrial genocide, and refused to let moral paralysis prevent him from doing the one thing he knew how to do. He practiced medicine, and in doing so he created a disease that killed nothing but Nazi plans. That phantom epidemic, invisible and harmless yet more powerful than any weapon, stands as proof that resistance is possible even in the darkest moments, and that sometimes the best way to fight evil is not with violence, but with the quiet subversion of a well-told lie in service of an undeniable truth. The story they didn't teach you in history class isn't just about one doctor and 8,000 Jews. It's about the power of knowledge, the courage of deception, and the eternal truth that tyranny, no matter how efficient, can always be defeated by someone who understands its systems better than it understands itself.